On a cold evening, the strange barking of a dog next to her deceased husband's old Ford made Mrs. Harlow feel uneasy. Without hesitation, Mrs. Harlow picked up the phone and called 911 for help. When the police arrived, Mrs. Harlow briefly explained, "This dog has been nesting in this car for many years, ever since my husband died." She paused for a moment, her eyes slightly sad. Hearing this, the two policemen nodded and carefully approached the old Ford, where the dog was still lying, their eyes watching them warily. Officers Keaton and Merrick arrived with flashlights. The dog's barking grew louder, its posture tense but not threatening. "Easy there," Officer Keaton whispered, his voice calm as he tried to soothe the dog. "It's okay, girl," he said softly. Although frightened, the dog did not attack. Officer Merrick reached for the door, the hinges creaking as it opened. Shining a flashlight inside, they discovered a pile of blankets on the back seat. As the light flickered over the scene, they uncovered a tiny, trembling figure. It took a moment to realize what they were seeing, a baby, shivering and exhausted in the cold. Keaton quickly called for medical help, while Merrick gently lifted the baby out. The dog stopped barking, watching intently as if ensuring the baby's safety. As an ambulance arrived, curious neighbors began gathering in the field. Whispered speculations spread through the crowd. Who would abandon a baby in such a state? And in Mr. Harlow's old Ford, no less. Despite the commotion, the dog remained silent, staying close to Merrick, who cradled the baby in his arms. From her porch, Mrs. Harlow observed the scene with a heavy heart. She had lived in the area for decades, knowing nearly every family's story. Yet, this event was unlike anything she'd ever witnessed. A sense of responsibility began to weigh on her. The baby, now in the hands of paramedics, was taken to the hospital for a thorough checkup. Meanwhile, Officer Keaton examined the car for clues. Among the blankets, he found a well-worn teddy bear with missing eyes and a faded photograph of a young woman. Showing it to Mrs. Harlow, he asked if she recognized the person, but she didn't. "We need to figure out who this baby belongs to," Merrick said, his tone firm. Keaton nodded, scanning the gathered crowd. The faces displayed a mix of fear and curiosity, but no one stepped forward with answers. The investigation was just beginning, but both officers were committed to uncovering the truth. By morning, news of the baby had spread, with local media fueling speculation about the child's identity. As more officers joined the search for the parents, the town's unease grew. Everyone had theories, but no concrete answers emerged. The next day, Mrs. Harlow woke to find the stray dog sitting on her porch. The same dog that had barked at anyone approaching now stared at her door quietly. Pausing, she felt the weight of the previous night's events. Why was the dog here now? A strange connection seemed to form between them. Opening the door, Mrs. Harlow saw the dog wag its tail faintly and approach her, sniffing the air and then her feet. "What is it, girl?" she asked softly. The dog gazed at her with pleading eyes, letting out a low whine. Realizing the dog might be looking for the baby, Mrs. Harlow crouched down, extending her hand for the dog to sniff before gently petting it. "You're searching for the baby, aren't you?" she whispered. The dog's tail thumped once against the porch, as though to confirm. Mrs. Harlow's chest tightened with emotion at the sight of the loyal animal. She had never witnessed such devotion from an animal before. She felt compelled to act. Speaking softly, she explained to the dog that the baby was not with her, but at the hospital. The dog perked up its ears and nudged her leg with its nose, letting out a quiet whine. Mrs. Harlow sighed, burdened by the situation. "All right, we'll go see the baby," she promised, gently patting the dog's head. Mrs. Harlow reached out to the police for an update, but received no new information. Determined, she decided to visit the hospital herself, fashioning a makeshift leash out of an old rope. She tied it carefully around Nova's neck and said, "Let's go." The dog walked beside her obediently, its steps light with purpose. As they made their way down the path, several neighbors stopped Mrs. Harlow, curious about the dog accompanying her. "Is that the same dog from the field?" asked Mr. Thompson, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Mrs. Harlow gave a small nod, a faint smile on her face. "Yes, it's the same one. We're heading to the hospital," she replied. Nova stayed close by, calmly observing the curious onlookers. However, when anyone tried to touch her, the dog barked protectively. "Easy now, girl," Mrs. Harlow murmured, tightening her hold on the makeshift leash. "She's just a bit cautious," she explained to those who asked, ensuring Nova stayed calm. The dog's unwavering loyalty was clear in her every step, earning the understanding nods of passers-by. The walk took longer than expected, as concerned townspeople stopped her frequently to ask about the baby's condition. "How is the baby doing?" Mrs. Clark inquired, worry etched across her face. "We're about to find out," Mrs. Harlow replied, her pace steady. Nova trotted alongside her, patient yet alert. Although the frequent stops slowed their journey, Mrs. Harlow appreciated the community's care for the child. When they finally reached the hospital, Mrs. Harlow greeted the receptionist, who glanced at Nova with curiosity. "You brought a dog?" the receptionist asked, noting the animal's calm demeanor. Mrs. Harlow nodded. "She's been with the baby since the night we found her," she explained. The receptionist appeared intrigued but quickly understood. "Wait here a moment," she said, stepping away to make a call. Nova sat quietly at Mrs. Harlow's feet. Before heading inside, Mrs. Harlow crouched down to reassure the dog. "You stay here, okay? I'll be back soon," she whispered, gently patting Nova's head. The dog gazed at her with trust, staying obediently by the entrance. Taking a deep breath, Mrs. Harlow stepped into the hospital, her heart racing with a mix of worry and anticipation. The receptionist returned and informed her that dogs were not allowed inside. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the dog has to stay outside," she said apologetically. Mrs. Harlow sighed, understanding the policy. "I'll figure something out," she replied. Nova, sensing the exchange, looked between the two women, her curiosity evident. Kneeling beside the dog, Mrs. Harlow softly instructed her to wait outside. Nova sat down obediently, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Harlow as she walked away. With one last glance, Mrs. Harlow entered the hospital, determination steadying her steps. The receptionist, still surprised by Nova's behavior, directed Mrs. Harlow to the children's ward. "Your dog is exceptionally well behaved," she remarked. "She's special," Mrs. Harlow replied simply, a warm smile on her face. The receptionist nodded, pointing down the hall. "The children's ward is that way. You'll find the baby there." Mrs. Harlow thanked her and began walking, her heart pounding harder with each step. As she approached the ward, she was greeted by a familiar nurse. "Mrs. Harlow, it's nice to see you again," the nurse said warmly. "How's the baby?" Mrs. Harlow asked, her voice filled with concern. "She's doing much better," the nurse replied. "Follow me, and I'll take you to her." Relief washed over Mrs. Harlow as she followed the nurse down the hallway. The walk felt endless, every step laden with anticipation. Finally, the nurse stopped in front of a door and opened it. "She's right in here," the nurse said, motioning for Mrs. Harlow to step inside. Mrs. Harlow took a deep breath, letting her eyes sweep the room until they settled on the small figure lying in the cot. A wave of emotion washed over her as she approached, gently tracing a finger along the baby's cheek. The little one stirred slightly, her tiny hands curling into fists. A soft smile spread across Mrs. Harlow's face as warmth filled her heart. "You're safe now," she murmured. The baby's eyes flickered open briefly before closing again, her breathing steady and calm. The nurse nearby explained that the baby was a girl, but no trace of her mother had yet been found. "We're doing everything we can to locate her family," she assured. Mrs. Harlow nodded, her worry growing deeper. "Thank you for taking care of her," she said sincerely. The nurse adjusted the baby's blanket with a gentle hand. "She's a strong little one," the nurse replied with a kind smile. Mrs. Harlow, standing by the nurse, felt a sense of resolve as she asked if it would be acceptable to give the baby a temporary name. The nurse nodded with a reassuring smile, and for a moment, Mrs. Harlow remained quiet, her mind wandering through memories of her late sister. After a brief pause, she decided on a name that felt right. Maeve. Holding the baby close, she whispered the name softly, tears brimming in her eyes. The baby stirred, snuggling into her arms, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric of Mrs. Harlow's shirt. In that quiet moment, a deep bond formed, unspoken but profoundly felt. When Mrs. Harlow stepped outside the hospital, she found Nova waiting patiently, her tail wagging faintly. The sight of the loyal dog brought a comforting warmth to her heart. Together, they began the walk home, their connection growing stronger with each step. Back at the house, Officers Merrick and Keaton were waiting on the porch. Merrick tipped his hat as Mrs. Harlow approached. "Good to see you, Mrs. Harlow. Everything all right?" he asked, noticing the tired lines on her face. Mrs. Harlow managed a small smile. "We just came back from the hospital. Maeve's doing well, and Nova here wouldn't let me go without her." She patted Nova's head gently, and the dog wagged her tail, her calm presence grounding them all. Keaton crouched down, giving Nova a curious look. "She's something else, isn't she? Sticking by that baby like she knew exactly what she needed. She's been guarding Maeve since the moment we found her," Mrs. Harlow said softly. "It's like she understands." Merrick chuckled, shaking his head in admiration. "Dogs have a way of surprising us. They pick up on things we don't even notice." "She's been my shadow ever since," Mrs. Harlow added, her voice warm with gratitude. "I don't think I'd have made it through the past few days without her." Keaton smiled as Nova sat obediently at Mrs. Harlow's feet. "You've got yourself a real guardian there. She's a good one." Nova, as if understanding the praise, let out a soft bark and wagged her tail, prompting a chuckle from Merrick. "Well, Nova," he said, "you keep up the good work." The moment settled into a quiet sense of appreciation as they stood together, bound by the shared care for the tiny life that had brought them all closer. The officers updated her on the investigation, mentioning their work on tracing the photograph and teddy bear found in the car. Mrs. Harlow expressed hope that these clues would lead them to Maeve's mother, her concern evident. She shared her decision to name the baby Maeve, a tribute to her late sister. The officers found the name beautiful and fitting, their shared determination to reunite the baby with her family, strengthening the quiet resolve of the moment. The next day, Officers Merrick and Keaton returned to the old Ford to search for anything they might have overlooked. In the light of day, they meticulously combed through the car but found nothing out of place. The baby's belongings were still there, carefully arranged, adding to the growing mystery. The officers speculated on the oddity of the situation. The care shown in leaving food, blankets, and a toy suggested that whoever abandoned the baby wanted her to be found safe. The unanswered questions lingered, weighing heavily on their minds. The mystery surrounding Maeve's abandonment remained unresolved, but their commitment to finding the truth only deepened. Officer Keaton picked up the teddy bear. "There's food, blankets, even this toy. This wasn't random," he pointed out. "Someone cared enough to make sure she'd be all right." The pieces didn't quite fit, and their curiosity deepened with each passing moment. Officer Merrick paused, deep in thought, as if weighing the strange details they'd uncovered. Everything about the situation felt deliberate, almost as if someone had ensured the baby would be found safe. Officer Keaton agreed, suggesting that the mother might not have willingly abandoned the child. There was an unspoken understanding between them. This was no simple case of neglect. Something larger was at play. As they left the scene, The old Ford and the baby lingered in their minds. Merrick voiced what both of them felt, a nagging sense that they were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Keaton's determination solidified. They wouldn't give up until they uncovered the truth, no matter how elusive it seemed. The investigation hit a wall. No one in town recognized the photograph or the worn teddy bear. Day after day, their efforts to track down leads ended in frustration. The silence from the community weighed heavily on them, as if the answers they sought were just out of reach. Returning to Mrs. Harlowe's home with Nova provided a rare moment of warmth amidst the tension. Mrs. Harlowe greeted them kindly, and Nova, who had once been fiercely protective, now sat calmly by her side. Keaton knelt down to gently pat the dog, surprised by how far she had come since that chaotic night. Mrs. Harlowe explained that patience and care had helped Nova rebuild her trust. Her bond with the dog reflected the resilience of both, a quiet reminder of how healing takes time. Despite this small victory, the officers admitted they were stuck. The mystery surrounding the baby's mother loomed larger with each passing day. Just then, Nova's behavior shifted. She whined and pawed at the door with urgency, her body tense, as if sensing something. Mrs. Harlowe hesitated briefly before opening the door. Nova bolted out, her movements quick and purposeful. The officers exchanged a glance and followed. Nova led them through familiar terrain, past the old Ford, and deeper into the woods. The forest was dense, its silence broken only by the sound of their hurried steps and Nova's persistent movement. Mrs. Harlowe struggled to keep up, her breath catching in the cool night air, but she didn't stop. The dog's determination gave them no choice but to trust her instincts. The path became more challenging as the forest thickened, branches clawing at their clothes and the ground uneven beneath their feet. Nova didn't waver, her nose to the ground, as if she were following an invisible trail. Keaton and Merrick pressed on, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The weight of the night and the towering trees around them made every step feel heavier. Finally, Nova stopped abruptly, near a dilapidated fence, her ears perked as she barked insistently. The group slowed, unsure of what lay ahead. Beyond the fence was an old building, its broken windows and crumbling facade hinting at abandonment. Nova's urgency didn't falter. She darted through a gap in the fence, her barking echoing through the still air. The officers exchanged a tense glance. They called for backup before cautiously approaching the building. Mrs. Harlowe stayed behind, worry etched on her face as Nova disappeared inside. The officers' flashlights illuminated the decay within, dirty mattresses, broken furniture, and the stale smell of neglect. Nova's barks led them to the third floor, where they found a frail young woman lying on a filthy mattress. She struggled to lift her head as they approached, her movements weak and pained. Nova sat protectively beside her, whining softly. Keaton knelt down, his voice calm as he reassured her that help was on the way. Merrick radioed for medical assistance, his tone steady despite the urgency. As they helped the woman to her feet, she asked in a trembling voice about her baby. Keaton assured her the child was safe, and tears welled up in her eyes as relief washed over her. The officers guided her down the stairs carefully, their resolve strengthened by the faint glimmer of hope in her expression. Back at the hospital, Mrs. Harlowe and Nova waited anxiously for news. When Keaton and Merrick arrived, they explained that the woman, Rowan, had been found in dire conditions but was now receiving care. Rowan's gratitude for their efforts and for the safety of her baby was evident, though her story of hardship and desperation left Mrs. Harlowe deeply moved. As the days passed, Rowan, Maeve, and Nova found refuge with Mrs. Harlowe. The house, once quiet and solitary, now brimmed with new life and hope. Together, they began piecing together a new chapter, one born from trust, perseverance, and a shared desire for healing. The mystery that had brought them together no longer felt like a burden, but a blessing. Nova's urgency pushed the group forward, her barking relentless as they approached a fence that marked the edge of a rougher part of town. The tall barrier loomed over them, casting deep shadows that only heightened the tension. Mrs. Harlow, glancing uneasily at the area ahead, explained it wasn't a place people visited willingly. Officer Keaton studied the fence for a moment, his expression tense, before carefully pushing it open. "All right, Nova," he said, his voice steady. "Show us what you've got." The dog slipped through the opening immediately, her movements sharp and determined. Mrs. Harlow and Officer Merrick followed closely, exchanging cautious glances. The creak of the gate shutting behind them seemed to echo in the still night, amplifying the unease they all felt. Nova led them to an old, decaying building, her barking becoming more urgent as they neared. "What's in there?" Mrs. Harlow murmured, her voice edged with worry. The building stood abandoned, its shattered windows and peeling walls a testament to years of neglect. Keaton approached the entrance with caution, scanning the area. He gestured for Merrick to keep close as they moved toward the doorway. "We're not going in blind," Keaton said firmly, pulling out his radio. Merrick nodded, his flashlight sweeping over the debris-strewn ground. "Feels like this place could collapse at any second," he muttered under his breath. Backup arrived shortly after, with Officer Ainsley staying with Mrs. Harlow as Keaton and Merrick prepared to enter. Nova, sensing the change, quieted briefly, standing alert at the doorway. "Be careful," Mrs. Harlow called softly, her voice filled with concern. Keaton gave a small nod before stepping into the building. Inside, the air was heavy and foul, thick with the stench of decay. Broken furniture and discarded items littered the floor, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. The sound of Nova's barking guided them up a narrow, creaking staircase to the third floor. "Over here!" Keaton called, his tone urgent as his flashlight illuminated a frail figure on a filthy mattress. The woman looked up weakly, her face pale and gaunt. Nova sat beside her, whining softly as if to offer comfort. Merrick crouched beside the woman, his voice gentle but firm. "We're here to help. Can you stand?" The woman struggled to sit up, her movements slow and labored. Keaton knelt to support her, while Merrick called for paramedics to meet them immediately. "She's safe," Keaton assured the woman softly when she whispered about her baby. "Your little girl is being cared for." Tears filled her eyes, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Thank you." The officers helped her to her feet, her weight leaning heavily against Keaton as they made their way carefully down the stairs. Outside, paramedics worked quickly to stabilize her before loading her into the ambulance. Keaton held her hand briefly, his quiet presence offering reassurance. Nearby, Nova sat watching, her mission seemingly accomplished. Mrs. Harlow, standing beside her, felt an overwhelming sense of relief. "She's going to be all right, isn't she?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Keaton nodded. "She has a chance now," he said simply. As the ambulance pulled away, its siren fading into the night, Nova wagged her tail faintly, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Harlow. Together, they stood in the quiet, the weight of the night gradually lifting. Though the mystery wasn't entirely solved, they all knew they had taken a step closer to uncovering the truth and bringing hope to a mother and her child. "Stay strong," Merrick said, his voice steady and calm. Keaton gave a reassuring nod, holding Rowan's hand. "We're right here with you," he added. As the ambulance doors closed and the siren blared, Nova sat quietly, watching it speed away. It seemed her role was complete. The officers felt a wave of relief wash over them. Officer Keaton and Officer Merrick soon shared the update with Mrs. Harlow. "We found Maeve's mother, Rowan," Keaton said. "She's in rough shape, but safe now." Mrs. Harlow's eyes widened and she let out a breath of relief. "Thank goodness," she murmured. Nearby, Nova wagged her tail, appearing to understand the good news. "They're taking her to the hospital," Merrick added. Mrs. Harlow nodded, feeling the burden on her heart ease a little. We should go there too, she decided. With that, Mrs. Harlow and Nova followed the ambulance to the hospital. Come on, Nova, she called, and the dog eagerly trotted by her side. The drive felt endless, her anticipation growing heavier with every passing moment. When they arrived, Mrs. Harlow quickly navigated her way to the emergency room. We're here to see Rowan, she told the receptionist. Nova sat quietly at her feet, a calm yet protective presence. The receptionist acknowledged her request and pointed the way to Rowan's room. Inside, Rowan, frail and visibly unwell, began explaining the heartbreaking reason behind her actions. I couldn't take care of her on the streets, she confessed weakly. I knew someone would find her in the car. Mrs. Harlow listened, her chest tightening at the young mother's words. You did what you thought was right, she said gently, her tone full of empathy. Rowan's tears spilled over as she nodded, clearly grateful for the understanding. Rowan soon recognized Mrs. Harlow from her volunteer work at the shelter. I've seen you there, Rowan said, managing a small smile. Mrs. Harlow was taken aback. You remember me? She asked. Rowan nodded again. I knew you were kind. I hoped you'd find Maeve. A deep connection sparked between them in that moment. I'll help you both, Mrs. Harlow promised, her voice resolute and warm. After weeks of care and recovery, Rowan moved in with Mrs. Harlow, along with baby Maeve and Nova. The once quiet house now brimmed with warmth and laughter. Maeve's giggles echoed through the rooms as Nova barked playfully, her tail wagging with joy. Rowan watched the scene unfold, her heart swelling with gratitude and relief. Mrs. Harlow smiled as she embraced the newfound harmony. Together, they began a new chapter, bound by love, resilience, and a shared sense of hope for the future. From an old car in a quiet field to a home filled with love and hope, Maeve's story is a beautiful reminder that kindness and perseverance can change lives in ways we never expect. Mrs. Harlow, Rowan, Nova, and Maeve found each other and built something extraordinary, a family born out of compassion and resilience. What about you? Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment where kindness made all the difference? We'd love to hear your stories. Share them in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, give it a like, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe for more stories like this.